Why does my family always have one child go missing at age 16? My cousin Ethan's bedroom door was still covered in his basketball posters when I found the phone hidden behind the baseboard. I was 15 years and 11 months old, exactly 3 weeks from my own 16th birthday, and I'd been sleeping in his old room at my grandparents' estate since my parents died in a car accident the previous year. The phone was an old flip model from 2019, the kind nobody used anymore, and when I charged it with a cable I found in the garage, it powered on to show 17 unread text messages. Every single one was from Ethan, sent in the 3 days before he disappeared 2 years ago. The messages got more desperate each day. First message said he needed help, that Grandpa Richard was planning something and he had to get out. The last message, sent at 2:47 in the morning on the day he vanished, just said, "If you find this, don't trust anyone in the family. Get out before you turn 16. I'd been living with my grandparents for 8 months by then, ever since the accident on the interstate that killed both my parents instantly. The grief counselor at school said I was doing remarkably well considering the circumstances, but what she didn't know was that I'd gone completely numb inside. I wasn't doing well. I was just existing, going through motions, letting my grandparents make every decision about my life, because I couldn't make any myself. They'd enrolled me in a private school near their mansion in the wealthy part of town, bought me new clothes, set me up in Ethan's old room, and told me repeatedly how lucky I was that they could provide stability during such a difficult time. My grandmother Helen was always baking things and asking about my homework, and Grandpa Richard took me to expensive dinners where he'd talk about family legacy and responsibility. They seemed like the perfect grieving grandparents stepping up when tragedy struck, and I'd been grateful for their support, even though something about the house always felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain. Ethan had been their grandson too, the son of my Uncle David, who lived in Seattle now. Ethan disappeared during a family vacation to the lake house 2 years ago when he was 16. The official story was that he went for a late-night swim and drowned, but they never found his body despite weeks of searching. The family held a memorial service with an empty casket, and everyone cried and talked about what a good kid he'd been, how tragic it was to lose someone so young. Uncle David barely spoke at the service and moved to Seattle 3 months later, cutting off contact with most of the family. I thought that was just his way of dealing with grief. But now, holding Ethan's hidden phone in my hands, I started wondering if he knew something the rest of us didn't. I scrolled through the other messages and found texts to someone named Julian, someone whose number wasn't saved in the phone. The messages to Julian talked about getting the proof and making them pay for what they did to Aunt Rebecca. I'd never heard anyone in the family mention an Aunt Rebecca. When I brought it up casually at dinner that night, asking if we had any relatives named Rebecca, my grandmother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. She exchanged a look with Grandpa Richard that lasted maybe 2 seconds, but in that moment, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was fear, or maybe anger, or something else I couldn't name. Then Grandma Helen smiled and said Rebecca was Richard's sister, who died in a car accident 30 years ago, way before I was born, and we didn't talk about her much because it upset Grandpa. The way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd prepared this answer for someone asking eventually. Grandpa Richard nodded and changed the subject to my upcoming birthday, asking what I wanted to do to celebrate turning 16. He said it was a special milestone and we should do something memorable. The way he emphasized special milestone while looking at me made my skin crawl for reasons I couldn't explain. That night I searched through old family photos stored in boxes in the attic, looking for any pictures of Rebecca. I found a few from the 1980s showing a teenage girl with dark hair standing next to a young Richard at what looked like a family gathering. On the back of one photo, someone had written, Rebecca, 15 inches in faded blue ink. On another photo from a year later, the same handwriting said, last photo before she left. Not died. Left. I took pictures of these photos with my phone and kept digging through the boxes, finding more inconsistencies in the family history. There was a memorial program for someone named Thomas Garrett, Richard's nephew, who apparently died at 16 in 1995. Another memorial program for a girl named Claire Garrett, who died at 16 in 2003. A newspaper clipping about a missing teenager named Marcus Garrett from 2011, Richard's grandnephew, who disappeared while hiking and was never found. Every single one was 16 years old when they died or disappeared. I started making a list on my phone, documenting every death or disappearance I could find in the family archives. The pattern went back 4 generations, with at least one teenager disappearing or dying at exactly 16 years old every few years. Sometimes there were gaps of 5 or 6 years between incidents, but the age was always the same. 16. Always 16. The causes varied: drowning, hiking accidents, car crashes, house fires, running away from home. But they all happened within days of the kid's 16th birthday, and in every case, Richard was somehow connected as a grandfather, great-uncle, or guardian. I felt sick looking at the list on my screen, counting 13 names including Ethan. 13 kids from the same extended family, all dead or missing at 16, across 40 years. My birthday was in 3 weeks. I was sleeping in the room of a cousin who'd tried to warn someone about this exact thing before he disappeared. And my grandparents were asking what special plans I wanted for my milestone birthday with smiles that suddenly seemed less comforting and more calculating. I needed to talk to someone, but I didn't know who to trust. Ethan's messages said not to trust anyone in the family, and looking at this list of dead teenagers, I understood why. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I found a pattern of deaths spanning decades in old photos? That my dead cousin left cryptic messages on a hidden phone? They'd think I was a traumatized kid, making up conspiracy theories to cope with losing my parents. I decided to reach out to Uncle David first, figuring he might know something about Ethan's disappearance that could help. I found his number in my grandmother's address book and called from a gas station payphone 2 miles from the house, using quarters I'd saved from my allowance. He answered on the 4th ring, and when I identified myself, there was a long pause before he spoke. His voice sounded rough, like he'd been drinking, and he asked why I was calling from a payphone. I told him I found Ethan's phone with messages about running away, and I needed to know what really happened at the lake house. He was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up, but then he said, "Get out of that house, Owen. Tonight. Don't wait until your birthday. Pack a bag and leave right now." The urgency in his voice made my hands shake, and I asked where I should go. He said he'd wire money to a Western Union in my name, and I should take a bus to anywhere else. Just get away from Richard. Before I could ask more questions, he hung up. I stood at that payphone for 10 minutes, trying to process what just happened. Uncle David's reaction confirmed something was seriously wrong, but his advice to run felt impossible to follow. I was 15, about to turn 16, with no money and nowhere to go. If I ran away, social services would just return me to my legal guardians, which were my grandparents. I needed proof of whatever was happening before anyone would take me seriously, which meant I had to stay in the house and investigate while trying not to tip off Richard or Helen that I suspected anything. I walked back to the mansion, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe there was a family cult. Maybe Richard was involved in trafficking. Maybe there was some inheritance scheme where he benefited from these deaths. I didn't know, but I had 3 weeks to figure it out before my own 16th birthday arrived. The next morning, I asked my grandmother if I could go through more family photos for a school project about genealogy. She seemed pleased by this and showed me to the library where more photo albums were stored in a locked cabinet. She unlocked it with a key from her pocket and told me to be careful with the older albums, since some were fragile. I spent the entire Saturday afternoon photographing pages from albums, focusing on any photos from the years when teenagers disappeared. I noticed something strange. In the months before each disappearance, there were always photos of the kid with Richard at some kind of special event. Thomas in 1995 was photographed with Richard at a birthday celebration, 3 days before he died. Claire in 2003 had photos from a weekend trip with Richard 2 weeks before her car accident. Marcus in 2011 went on a fishing trip with Richard the day before he disappeared while hiking. Ethan had photos from a camping trip with Richard exactly 1 week before he vanished at the lake house. I remembered now that Grandpa Richard had mentioned wanting to take me on a special camping trip for my birthday, just the 2 of us, to a cabin he owned in the mountains. He'd brought it up 3 times in the past month, always emphasizing how it would be a meaningful bonding experience and a tradition he did with all the boys in the family when they turned 16. I'd agreed because I hadn't wanted to seem ungrateful, but now I understood that camping trip was probably when whatever happened to these kids would happen to me. I had 2.5 weeks to figure out what Richard was doing during these trips and how to stop it. I found the number Julian that Ethan had been texting and called it from a burner phone I bought at a convenience store. A man answered, sounding cautious, and I introduced myself as Ethan's cousin. I explained that I found Ethan's phone and needed information about what they'd been investigating. Julian was silent for a moment, then asked me to confirm some details only Ethan's family would know. After I answered his questions, he said, "Ethan thought your grandfather was selling kids. He found bank records showing large deposits after each disappearance." My stomach turned, and I asked if he still had copies of those records. Julian said everything Ethan had collected was on a USB drive that Ethan was supposed to give him the night he disappeared, but Ethan never showed up. He assumed Richard had found out about the investigation and did something to stop Ethan from exposing him. Julian turned out to be a private investigator who specialized in missing persons cases. He'd been working with Rebecca, Richard's sister, before she died in 2018. Rebecca had survived whatever happened when she turned 16 by running away, and she'd spent decades trying to prove Richard was responsible for the disappearances. She'd hired Julian to help build a case, and Ethan had contacted Julian after finding some of Rebecca's old research in the attic. Julian offered to help me, but he was honest about the challenges. Without Ethan's evidence and with Rebecca dead, we had nothing concrete that would hold up in court. Everything I'd found so far was circumstantial, a pattern of deaths, suspicious timing, cryptic messages. We needed proof of what actually happened to these kids. We needed to find where Richard was taking them or what he was doing with them. I spent the next week playing the perfect grateful grandson while secretly documenting everything. I installed a recording app on my phone that ran in the background during conversations. I photographed documents I found in Richard's study when he was out. I made copies of his calendar and appointment books. I noticed he had a monthly meeting scheduled with someone named Leonard Voss at an address in the industrial district. When I looked up Leonard Voss online, I found nothing. No social media, no business records, no property ownership. The address on Richard's calendar was listed as a warehouse owned by a company called Garrett Holdings, which which I discovered was a shell company Richard controlled. The same shell company had purchased property in 5 different states over the past 20 years, always in remote areas. Julian ran background checks on Leonard Voss and found that it was an alias used by a man named Leonard Cross, who had 2 prior arrests for human trafficking that were dismissed due to lack of evidence. Julian said this matched the pattern he and Rebecca had suspected. Richard was connected to a trafficking network that moved teenagers through various locations, probably selling them to buyers who wanted children with no paper trail. The kids who died in accidents were probably the ones who tried to fight back or escape. I felt physically sick thinking about what happened to Ethan, to all those kids in the photos, while their families held memorial services and mourned them as tragic accidents. We had 11 days until my birthday when Julian called with a plan. He had contacts in the FBI who specialized in human trafficking cases, and he'd spoken to an agent named Kelsey Moore who was interested in the pattern of disappearances. Agent Moore wanted to meet with me to hear what I'd found and see if there was enough evidence to open an investigation. Julian warned me that the FBI moved slowly and probably wouldn't be able to do anything before my birthday, which meant I needed to be prepared to either run or find a way to delay the camping trip Richard had planned. I agreed to meet Agent Moore at a coffee shop across town the next day after school. Agent Kelsey Moore was a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor and a recording device she placed on the table between us. She had me walk through everything I'd discovered, and she took notes while I talked. When I showed her the photos of the pattern of deaths and the connection to Richard's camping trips, she said it was concerning, but not enough for a warrant. When I mentioned Leonard Voss and the warehouse, her expression changed. She said Leonard Cross was someone they'd been tracking for years in connection with a trafficking ring, but they'd never been able to build a case against him. If Richard was meeting with Cross regularly, that was a link they could potentially investigate. She asked if I'd be willing to wear a wire to my birthday camping trip to record anything Richard said that might be incriminating. The thought of going on that camping trip while wearing a wire made me want to throw up, but I understood it might be the only way to get proof. Agent Moore explained that I'd have a GPS tracker and a panic button, and they'd have agents positioned within minutes of the location at all times. She said if anything started to feel dangerous, I should activate the panic button immediately, and they'd come in. I asked what would happen if Richard checked me for wires or found the tracker, and she was honest that it was a risk. She said I didn't have to do this, that I could just refuse to go on the trip and let them investigate through other means. But without direct evidence of what Richard was doing, it could take years to build a case, years during which other kids might disappear. I had 8 days to decide when I found another piece of evidence that made the decision for me. In Richard's office, hidden in a locked drawer I managed to pick open with a paperclip, I found a ledger. The ledger had dates and amounts going back to 1992, all written in Richard's handwriting. Next to each date was a set of initials and a dollar amount. The amounts ranged from $50,000 to $200,000. When I compared the dates to the list of disappearances I'd compiled, they matched. Every single disappearance had a corresponding entry in the ledger within a week of the incident. Next to Ethan's initials, written in August 2 years ago, was the amount $125,000. My hands shook so badly I could barely take photos of the pages, but I documented every entry before carefully replacing the ledger exactly as I'd found it. I sent the photos to Agent Moore immediately, and she called me within an hour. She said this was exactly the kind of evidence they needed, showing a clear financial motive and a pattern spanning decades. She was starting the process of getting warrants for Richard's financial records and the warehouse, but she emphasized that these things took time, and there were no guarantees they'd have everything in place before my birthday. She strongly recommended I find a reason to avoid the camping trip, maybe claim I was sick or have a scheduling conflict. She said my safety was more important than gathering more evidence, and they could work with what we had, but I knew that wasn't enough. Ledgers could be explained away, handwriting could be disputed, and without proof of what actually happened to these kids, Richard might walk free on some technicality. I told Agent Moore I'd do it. I'd wear the wire and go on the camping trip and get Richard to say something incriminating on tape. She made me promise to activate the panic button at the first sign of danger, and she spent the next 2 days training me on how to naturally steer conversations toward topics we needed on record. She taught me what kinds of questions would be admissible in court and what would be considered entrapment. She explained that I needed to let Richard say things without me suggesting or leading him to conclusions. The wire itself was a small device that looked like a button on my flannel shirt, with a microphone so tiny I could barely see it. The GPS tracker was built into my watch, which looked like a normal sports watch I might wear camping. My birthday fell on a Friday. Richard had planned for us to leave Thursday night and spend 2 nights at his mountain cabin before returning Sunday morning. On Wednesday, Agent Moore positioned her team at various points along the route to the cabin, all of them ready to move within minutes if I activated the panic button. Julian drove by the house twice that day just to make sure I knew I wasn't alone in this. I packed my bag with camping gear, the wire hidden in my shirt pocket, and the watch strapped to my wrist. I tried to act normal at dinner Wednesday night, making conversation about school and thanking my grandparents for planning this special trip. Grandma Helen seemed emotional, hugging me longer than usual, and telling me I'd grown into such a remarkable young man. The way she looked at me made me wonder if she knew what Richard was doing, if she'd known all along about all those kids, or if she was just as manipulated as everyone else in the family. Thursday morning, I activated the wire before Richard and I loaded the truck. Agent Moore's voice came through the tiny earpiece I wore, barely audible, confirming they were receiving audio and tracking my location. Richard seemed relaxed as we drove north into the mountains, talking about the history of the cabin and how his father used to take him there when he was young. He said it was important for men in the family to have these traditions, places where they could connect away from the distractions of modern life. I asked if he'd brought Ethan here, and he said yes. They'd had a wonderful trip talking about Ethan's future and what he wanted to do with his life. The casual way he said it while knowing what happened to Ethan made my skin crawl. We arrived at the cabin around 3 in the afternoon. It was more isolated than I'd expected, at least 20 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest with no other buildings visible. Richard parked the truck, and we unloaded our gear, and he showed me around the property. There was the main cabin, a small shed for tools, and a root cellar dug into the hillside that he said was for storing food during longer stays. Something about the root cellar made me uneasy. The door was new, much newer than the rest of the cabin, and it had a deadbolt lock on the outside. Richard saw me looking at it and said he'd had problems with bears getting into the food storage, so he'd reinforced the door. The explanation sounded reasonable, but the size of the lock seemed excessive for keeping out animals. We spent the afternoon setting up camp and preparing dinner. Richard was talking more than usual, sharing stories about the family and asking about my plans for after high school. He wanted to know if I'd thought about college, what I wanted to study, whether I planned to stay local or go somewhere else. I gave vague answers while trying to steer the conversation toward the other kids he'd brought here. I mentioned that I'd been looking through old family photos and noticed he seemed to have a tradition of these birthday trips with lots of the teenagers in the family. He smiled and said yes, it was something he'd done for decades, a way of marking the transition from childhood to young adulthood. He said it was important to have these conversations one-on-one, away from parents and siblings, so the young person felt comfortable being honest about their goals and fears. After dinner, as the sun was setting, Richard suggested we take a walk through the woods. I hesitated, my hand moving instinctively toward the watch on my wrist, where the panic button was built in. Agent Moore's voice crackled softly in my earpiece, telling me they were tracking my movement and had agents within 3 miles. Richard noticed my hesitation and asked if something was wrong. I said I was just tired from the drive, and he suggested we postpone the walk until morning. We spent the evening by the fire, and Richard opened a bottle of expensive whiskey, pouring himself a glass and offering me one. I declined, saying I didn't drink, and he seemed pleased by this, commenting that I was mature for my age. Around 10 at night, Richard said he needed to check something in the root cellar before we turned in for the night. He took a flashlight and walked over to the cellar door, unlocking it with a key from his pocket. I watched from the cabin window as he descended into the cellar and stayed down there for almost 15 minutes. When he came back up, he was carrying something small that he put in his truck. I couldn't see what it was, but the way he looked around before placing it in the vehicle made it clear he didn't want me to notice. I waited until he was inside and using the bathroom, then quietly walked to the truck. In the back seat, covered with a tarp, was a metal briefcase with a combination lock. My hands shook as I took a photo of it before returning to the cabin. I barely slept that night, listening to Richard snoring from the other bed and running through scenarios in my mind. If he was planning to do something, when would it happen? Tomorrow during the walk through the woods? Was the root cellar involved somehow? I kept my hand near the watch, ready to press the panic button if anything felt immediately dangerous. Morning came and Richard made breakfast, talking cheerfully about the day ahead. He said there was a beautiful overlook about an hour's hike from the cabin that he wanted to show me, a place where you could see 3 mountain ranges at once. The way he described it sounded genuinely excited, like a grandfather sharing something meaningful with his grandson, and that somehow made everything more disturbing. How could someone sound so normal, so caring, while planning something evil? We started the hike around 9 in the morning. Richard led the way on a trail that was barely visible, clearly not well traveled by other hikers. He talked as we walked, asking me more questions about school, about my feelings since losing my parents, about whether I felt happy living with him and Helen. I gave careful answers, trying to sound natural while steering toward topics that might get him to reveal something. I mentioned feeling grateful for their support, but sometimes wondering about other family members who'd been through hard times. I brought up Rebecca, asking if he ever thought about his sister and what her life might have been like if she hadn't left. Richard stopped walking. His back was to me, and for a long moment he didn't move or speak. Then he turned around, and his expression had changed. The warm grandfather facade was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. He asked how I knew about Rebecca. I said I'd found old photos in the attic and was just curious about family history. He studied my face, clearly trying to determine if I was lying. Then he said Rebecca was troubled, had run away because she couldn't handle the responsibilities that came with being part of the family. He said sometimes young people don't understand that sacrifice is necessary for the family's prosperity. The way he said sacrifice made my blood run cold. I asked what kind of sacrifice, trying to keep my voice steady. Richard turned and continued walking, talking over his shoulder. He said the family had maintained its wealth and position for generations through strategic decisions that sometimes required difficult choices. He said every family had its traditions, its ways of ensuring the next generation inherited something of value. He said I was smart enough to understand that privilege came with obligations. I was recording every word, but his statements were still vague enough that they could be interpreted multiple ways in court. I needed him to be more specific, to admit to something that couldn't be explained away. We reached the overlook, and it was as beautiful as he'd described, but I barely registered the view because Richard was pulling out his phone and making a call. He walked a few feet away, speaking quietly to whoever answered. I heard him say, "We're at the location. Confirm arrival time for pickup." He hung up and turned to me with a smile, saying we should head back to the cabin because he had a surprise planned for the evening. My heart was racing, and my thumb found the panic button on the watch. Agent Moore's voice came through the earpiece, telling me to keep Richard talking and that they were moving into position. On the walk back, I asked Richard directly who he'd called. He said it was someone he wanted me to meet, a family friend who helped with certain business arrangements. I asked what kind of business, and he stopped walking again. This time, when he looked at me, I saw recognition in his eyes. He knew that I knew something. He asked to see my watch, saying it looked like a nice model, and he was curious about the brand. My mind raced through options. If he found the GPS tracker, if he realized I was wired, I'd lose any chance of getting him to confess on tape. But if I refused to show him the watch, he'd know for certain something was wrong. I decided to activate the panic button. I pressed it once, holding for 3 seconds like Agent Moore had taught me. Then I took off the watch and handed it to Richard, saying it was just a basic sports watch I'd gotten for Christmas. He turned it over in his hands, examining it carefully. He was about to hand it back when his phone rang. He answered, and I heard someone on the other end speaking urgently. Richard's face darkened, and he ended the call. He looked at me and said, "The FBI is here, aren't they?" There was no point in lying anymore. I said yes, and that I knew what he'd been doing to those kids, that I had evidence of the trafficking and the money, that it was over. Richard laughed, actually laughed. He said I had no idea what I'd just done, that the people he worked with didn't take kindly to interference. He said even if the FBI arrested him, there were others in the network who would ensure I never testified, that my life would be in danger from people far more ruthless than he could ever be. He said I'd made a mistake thinking this ended with him. But before he could say more, I heard voices shouting and saw FBI agents emerging from the woods. Agent Moore was in front, weapon drawn, calling for Richard to get on the ground. Richard's expression shifted from anger to resignation, and he raised his hands, dropping the watch. The next few hours were chaos. More agents arrived, securing the cabin and the root cellar. I watched as they brought up evidence from the cellar. Documents, hard drives, what looked like medical equipment. Agent Moore stayed with me while I gave my statement, explaining everything I'd found and recorded. She said the recordings were clear and admissible, that Richard had said enough on tape to support charges. When I asked what was in the root cellar, she said it appeared to be a temporary holding facility, a place where Richard kept kids before transferring them to whoever was buying them. They found evidence that multiple children had been held there over the years, including items that belonged to Ethan. Richard was arrested and charged with human trafficking, conspiracy, and multiple counts of kidnapping. Leonard Cross was arrested the same day at the warehouse in a coordinated raid. The FBI seized financial records showing transactions between Richard and an international trafficking network that operated in 7 countries. The ledger I'd photographed turned out to be critical evidence, directly tying Richard to payments received for each missing child. Agent Moore told me that my willingness to wear the wire and get Richard on tape had made the case airtight in ways that would have taken them years to build otherwise. The media coverage was immediate and overwhelming. The story of a wealthy businessman running a trafficking operation while disguised as a devoted grandfather made national news. My name was kept confidential because I was a minor, but everyone in the family knew I was responsible for exposing Richard. The reactions were mixed. Some family members called me a hero for stopping him. Others accused me of destroying the family reputation and refused to speak to me. Uncle David called to say he wished he'd been brave enough to investigate when Ethan disappeared, that maybe his son would still be alive if he'd pushed harder instead of running away to Seattle. That conversation broke something open in me, all the grief and anger and terror I'd been holding in for weeks, and I cried for the first time since my parents died. Grandma Helen was arrested 3 weeks later as an accessory after investigators proved she'd known about the trafficking and had helped cover up several disappearances by providing false alibis for Richard. She pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, and in her statement, she admitted she'd known for decades what Richard was doing, but stayed silent because she was terrified of him. She said he'd threatened to hurt her, to hurt other family members, to destroy everything if she ever told anyone. The revelation that she'd known about kids being sold and had done nothing to stop it made me physically ill. I'd lived in her house, eaten her food, let her hug me while she knew what her husband had planned for me. The FBI's investigation expanded to identify all the children who'd been trafficked through Richard's network. They found that 13 kids from our family had been sold over 40 years. 5 were confirmed dead. 3 were found alive in various locations, including a woman in Eastern Europe who'd been taken at 16 in 1996 and had survived by eventually escaping her captors. The other 5 remained missing, their fates unknown. Ethan's body was recovered from a wooded area near the cabin, buried in a shallow grave. He'd been killed the night he disappeared, probably when he tried to run or fought back against being taken. Uncle David flew back for the burial, and this time, there was a body in the casket. I testified at Richard's trial 6 months later. The courtroom was packed with media and family members and survivors from other trafficking cases. Richard sat at the defense table looking smaller than I remembered, no longer the imposing grandfather figure who'd controlled so many lives for so long. I told the jury everything I'd discovered, walking them through the pattern of disappearances and the evidence I'd collected. I described the camping trip and what Richard had said on the recordings. When Richard's lawyer cross-examined me, trying to suggest I'd misunderstood or exaggerated things, Agent Moore's testimony backed up every detail. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Richard guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Julian came to the trial every day, sitting in the back row. After the verdict, he told me he wished Rebecca had lived to see this moment. He said she'd spent her entire adult life trying to expose what Richard was doing, and that it took tremendous courage for me to finish what she'd started. He gave me a box of Rebecca's research, files she'd compiled over decades documenting her suspicions and tracking the disappearances. Reading through her notes, I saw how close she'd come to proving everything, but had never found the concrete evidence needed to convince authorities. I understood that my ability to find that evidence had been partly luck, being in the right place, finding Ethan's phone, having access to Richard's office. But Julian said it was more than luck. It was determination and intelligence, and a willingness to risk everything to save others. I stayed with a foster family for the remaining months until I turned 18. The foster parents were kind people who understood I needed space to process everything. I finished high school and started therapy with a counselor who specialized in trauma. The counselor helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just the stress of the investigation, but the aftermath of discovering that my entire family structure had been built on lies and abuse. She said it was normal to feel angry and betrayed and scared, that healing would take time. I applied to colleges far from home, wanting distance from the mansion and the family and the memories. I got accepted to several schools and chose one in Oregon, near where Uncle David had relocated. The 3 children who were found alive through the investigation all struggled with reintegration. One girl who'd been taken at 16 in 2003 and found in a trafficking ring in Thailand couldn't remember her original name or family. She'd been moved between locations so many times and given so many different identities that she'd lost connection to who she'd been before. The FBI arranged for counseling and support, but there was no easy path back to normal life after years of captivity and abuse. I thought about how close I'd come to being in her position, how different my life would be if I hadn't found that phone, or if Agent Moore hadn't believed me. The randomness of it haunted me for months. I started speaking at events about human trafficking, sharing my story to help educate others about warning signs and patterns. Agent Moore invited me to participate in training sessions for law enforcement, teaching them what to look for in family-based trafficking cases. She said these cases were harder to spot because they came disguised as normal family dynamics, with trusted relatives exploiting their positions of authority. She said my case had changed protocols for how the FBI approached missing persons reports involving family members, leading to faster intervention in several subsequent cases. Knowing that something good came from the nightmare made it slightly more bearable. Uncle David and I grew closer after the trial. He moved back from Seattle and bought a house near the college I was attending. We had dinner every Sunday, and slowly he opened up about Ethan, about the guilt he carried for not investigating harder when his son disappeared. He said he'd suspected Richard had something to do with it, but convinced himself he was being paranoid, that he was letting grief cloud his judgment. He said if he could go back, he'd have torn that cabin apart looking for answers instead of accepting the story about a drowning accident. I told him I understood, that Richard had been skilled at manipulation and making people doubt their instincts. We both carried guilt about things we thought we should have done differently, and we were both trying to learn to forgive ourselves. On my 18th birthday, I visited Ethan's grave. It was the first time I'd been back to the cemetery since the burial, and I brought flowers and sat there for an hour talking to him. I told him I'd found his phone, that his messages had saved my life and exposed Richard. I told him about the trial and the convictions and the other kids who'd been found. I said I was sorry it took so long for anyone to listen, that he'd tried to tell people and no one had believed him in time. The wind picked up while I was sitting there, rustling through the trees around the cemetery, and I let myself imagine it was Ethan somehow acknowledging that he heard me. I'm 21 now, finishing my last year of college and planning to go to law school. I want to work on cases involving human trafficking and family abuse, using what I learned to help other survivors get justice. The investigation into Richard's network is still ongoing, with new leads emerging as more victims come forward. Agent Moore calls me occasionally to update me on the progress, and she said they've identified at least 40 children who were trafficked through the same operation over the years, not just from our family, but from others Richard had connections to, through business and social circles. The scope of what he did, the number of lives destroyed, is still being calculated. Sometimes people ask if I regret investigating, if I wish I'd just run away like Uncle David suggested, or stayed ignorant about what was happening. The answer is complicated. The knowledge of what Richard did, what he planned to do to me, has changed me in fundamental ways I can't undo. I have nightmares about the root cellar, about what would have happened if I'd gone on that camping trip without the wire. I struggle with trust and constantly watch for warning signs in people around me. But I also know that if I hadn't investigated, Richard would still be operating, and more kids would have disappeared. The 3 survivors who were found would still be in captivity. Ethan's body would still be in an unmarked grave with no one knowing the truth of how he died. I choose to believe it was worth it. That Ethan would be proud I finished what he started. That Rebecca would be grateful someone finally exposed Richard. That the cost to my own peace of mind was justified by the lives saved and the closure brought to families. On harder days, when the nightmares are especially vivid or the anxiety gets overwhelming, I remind myself that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite being terrified, choosing to act when it would be easier to look away. I was scared every day of that investigation, every moment of that camping trip, every second of my testimony. But I did it anyway, and that's something Richard can never take away from me. The family mostly fractured after the trial. Some relatives stayed in touch, but many couldn't handle the shame of being associated with what Richard had done. The mansion was sold to pay legal fees and restitution to victims. Grandma Helen is in prison serving her sentence, and I've never visited her. I don't know if I ever will. Some betrayals are too complete to forgive, and knowing she could have stopped Richard at any point and chose not to feels unforgivable to me now. Maybe someday I'll feel differently, but today I don't. I found out last month that the woman who was rescued from Europe, the one taken in 1996, has written a memoir about her experience. I bought a copy and read it in one sitting, crying through most of it. Her description of being taken, of the years of abuse and survival, of finally escaping and rebuilding her life, was both devastating and inspiring. At the end, she thanked me by name for exposing the network and helping her finally get closure about where she came from and what happened to her. She said she'd spent years not knowing why she'd been taken or who had sold her, and knowing the truth, as painful as it was, allowed her to finally process the trauma and move forward. That acknowledgement meant everything to me. If you made it this far, I hope you understand why I did what I did, why I couldn't just run away or let the adults handle it. Sometimes the adults are the problem, and sometimes the only way to stop evil is to face it directly, even when you're terrified, even when everyone tells you you're crazy. Ethan tried to stop Richard and died for it. Rebecca tried for decades and died before seeing justice. I was just the one who happened to find the right evidence at the right time and had people like Julian and Agent Moore willing to believe me. The pattern is broken now. No more kids will disappear at 16 because of Richard. That's worth whatever price I paid to make it happen. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.